Well, this follows directly on, and yes, it's long and long-winded, and so this really requires a reference to the other couple of episodes on Vervaeke that I've done in this series. I'm halfway through episode 49 of Awakening from the Mini Crisis, trying to understand the imaginal gnosis, the divine double, aspirational development, and the term angel in connection with. No, that will do. With symbols, I would say. So we just got to the bit about Jung. So what I'm going to do is we were talking about self-transcendence through the process of self-creation with reference to the divine double or sacred second self or angel or daimonion or Jungian anima as a of S2, a second self that shines into our current framing, and that by being in a process of aspirational development with this second self, one can self-transcend by internalizing a certain new perspective, and unlocking and indwelling the world in a different way that makes certain perspectives, a certain way of participating available that was not before. And now I need to I'm gonna try it like this. Excuse me while I'm just doing this. Okay, so we've been talking about all this in terms of what Vervaeke is now calling sacred second self. It's yeah, it's again, it's a symbol of S2. It's a symbol of that self which we're aspiring to become. And so this is another way of talking about the soul. And we want to be careful though, because we can actually distinguish between these different perspectives and understand how they may be more or less infused with soul. They may be more inhibiting of or affording of a, let's say, soulful way of being. And for me, I would simply understand soul in this context as what is, unique, personal, most alive about one. When we think of soulfulness, we think of vitality. I mean, I do, and I think of uniqueness as well, and also creativity, but not, it's more about a way of being. And so I think we can see that these different perspectives may afford that more or less. I'm not sure I want to assign the soul to one perspective. It may be that different perspectives are more or less infused with soul, but I don't know if I don't know if we really know, right? Okay, so this is allowing us to bridge over to Jung. So again, in Jung, we have this relationship with the anima or soul that allows one to dialogue with the unconscious, and that the by assuming the identity, by taking on the identity of the anima or soul, one can, in Jungian terms, engage with the self, engage with the unconscious, and be infused with that unconscious in such a way that the soul acts as a kind of midwife. It can give birth to what Jung calls the self. Now, I think importantly here, we're going to start talking about the world. Oh, we were talking about the world soul, but we might get to that. And then I'll leave it for the moment because I thought it was here, but it's not. Sorry, let's move on. Yep, we've lost the soul. Modern man in search of a soul. We need to get that back. Yeah, so Jung is what Vervaeke thinks Jung is talking about is this loss of a relationship to the sacred second self or divine double. We need a way of aspiring. We need a way of becoming Socratically to respond to the meaning crisis. That's why there are these deep connections between Corbin and Jung. Yeah, so this is Jungian individuation. It's a developmental process. It's a notion of self-transformation. Yep. So Jung does this as a psychologist. It's a psychological process. So Vervaeke wants to contrast him with Freud. Freud we know is important, yes. Yep. So Freud uses this hydraulic model, basing the psyche on this model of a Newtonian machine, like a steam engine. And Jung replaces this with an organic metaphor. We see this also through people like Alan Watts, um, and Suzuki. The Chinese philosophy is also deeply using it's an organic way of speaking about self-transcendence. Yeah, so Jung sees the psyche as a self-organizing dynamical system, as a kind of autopoietic being. Yeah, and the psyche is sort of going through this complex process of self-organization. So individuation is kind of organic self-organizing. It's a process that is neither made nor received, but is participated in. This is all rather obvious to me, so let's continue. Yep, so Jung gives a psychological analog of the Platonic ideas. So, sorry, the Platonic idea of the form, which is archetypes. Archetypos is in foundational patterns. Yeah, so there's formative founding patterns of the psyche. And it's, look, the thing is that it's not just the psyche. This is why I can refer gratefully to people like Kieran Legrice in Jung on astrology, who really summarize and draw down some of the later Jung into this deep connection between psyche and cosmos, that the later Jung is talking about the unconscious and about the archetypes. He talks about them as psychoid, which is as these organizing principles of the psyche, and organizing principles of the psyche and cosmos. So not just within the psyche, but in the self-world relationship, within the relationship between psyche and cosmos. But the idea here is that the world is most deeply personified, that personification is actually an ontological grounding, and that as we fade over into the abstract or fade down into the concrete, that we fall away from soul, that we fall away from personification, and that we actually that that makes things less real. This is partly what Jordan Hall and other people are talking about. This is like the whole point. For them, the significance of Christ is that he's a person. Revelation in the form of a person that can one can relate with. But we don't see this through most of Jung, right? Through most of Jung, the archetypes are organizing the psyche, not psyche and cosmos. Yep. So the archetypes are kind of like the psychological versions of the Platonic form. I think we can see here that it's possible through this process of this process of aspirational development, working with the quote sacred second self is also quite similar to working with parts in IFS. It's also quite similar to working with different archetypal forces, right? And so I think we obviously want to be quite careful when working with phenomena which are very powerful. But I think we can see that, especially through the work in Human Origins and the other playlists, that these social categories like mother, father, and divine child are some of the oldest, the oldest that we have, and may in fact come with the essence of human culture. The origins of human culture have to do with this capacity to not only organize, classify the natural world into social categories, primarily social categories, and then to reconstitute the boundaries between them. What this is really saying, and again, the first 5 episodes in the series on human origins are relevant here, is that the process of the reconstitution of the boundaries between or relationships between different archetypal forces is very, very, very close to the origins of what it means to be human, the origins of what humanity is about. I won't elaborate on that, but I'm just pointing to the significance and importance of these archetypal forces that may not be obvious. Okay, so archetypes are not images. We have to understand them imaginally, in imaginal terms. They're not things that we possess, but they can lead us into an aspirational process of individuation. They're also unconsciously influencing us. So the idea would be to become more conscious of the influence of pre-existing, meaning already existing archetypal forces. So Vervaeke would understand them as systems of constraints. They're virtual engines that regulate the self-organization of what is salient to us. Yep, so he gives the example. If the hero archetype is active, doesn't mean he's carrying around images of a hero in the head. It means that there's an imaginal relationship in which the salience landscaping with the world is being transformed. So one is anagogically interacting with the world and undergoing aspirational self-transformation, such that one is becoming more and more heroic. We can think about the archetypes adverbally rather than adjectively. It's a way. An archetype is a way in which one is anagogically coming to be. It's not something that we possess and reflect upon. Okay. So Jung argues that all of these, like the psyche as a whole, they're virtual engines of self-organizing processes that are autopoietic. They have life to them. They're living. They're actually living. Way meaning method and path of development. The archetypes are a way that the psyche makes itself as a living organism. Okay, go further into Jung here. So yeah, so Jung talked about the self, which is different than the sacred second self, which Vervaeke has been discussing. Obviously, he's influenced by Vedanta here, but I think, look, yes, he is influenced by Vedanta, but Jung is primarily influenced by Jung's own experiences, detailed in the Red Book and then consolated in the psychological types, first and foremost. Yeah, so the relationship between ego and self is kind of equivalent to Atman and Brahman. Wait, no, sorry. Yeah, Jung sort of described, yeah, he's sort of talking about the self. Again, it's like ego and self is in Jung is kind of like the earth and the sun. And so individuation is the process of coming to sort of recenter the personality on orbit around the self, which is this deeper center of awareness that is between conscious and unconscious, that Vervaeke thinks is equivalent to Atman. And it's like Jung describes the self as the monad that I am, which is kind of like the entirety of one's individual experience. It's kind of like one of the jewels in Indra's net is Atman to Brahman. Yeah, it's not a decadent romantic inner essence or self. It's something that we aspire to become more like. Yep, so there's a temptation to narcissism because of this romantic misunderstanding of the inner true self that I have. The thing here is that Viveki is saying that Jungian self is sort of trying to point to the sacred second self, and I don't think that's right. I think in Jung, self is sort of equivalent to God, or it's the anima is the anima or soul is the symbolic self, the divine double, through which one may give birth to the capital S self. And I've talked about this at length in the series on psychological types, the last episode, which is episode 25 in particular. Yep, ego is archetype of conscious mind, self is kind of, yeah, archetype of archetypes in a certain way. It's not, it's a certain archetype. It's what Jung calls, it's, yeah, we don't know what it is, but it's referred to in symbols that involve mandalas, like the divine child, the philosopher's stone, the holy grail, the treasure hard to attain, um, yeah, the golden snitch, all of these, there's so many symbols of the self. I've talked about this. I mean, this is what the series in Dreams is about. This is what the series on Christ, the symbol of the self, is about. Like I've published on this a lot. Yeah. Okay. So for Plato, it's like the notion of good. So for Jung, the self is kind of like the it's what's regulating the self-organization of the psyche as a whole. So it's kind of like the principle of autopoiesis itself. It's kind of like the ultimate virtual engine that constellates all the other virtual engines, so that the psyche can continue its process of autopoietic self-organization. Again, you want to be careful there because in things like IFS, there are certain qualities that are attributed to the self, namely the eight C's. I was talking about those qualities of compassion, care, courage, and so on. The others don't spring to mind. But the thing is that for Jung, it's we get images of the self, God images, such as mandalas or such as for Jung Christ. But the self is necessarily something which is beyond. It's not something that can be qualified, or it's yeah, he thinks of these mandalas as images or symbols of the self. So we want to be careful about the qualities that we ascribe to it, because the thing is that he's kind of saying this is the mistake that people keep making. Like Jung takes, for example, issue with God is good quality, the quality, like the defined quality of goodness. He's saying, no, hang on. If you define something, you kind of define its opposite as well by implication. But I think this is all reasonable. Yeah, so we get this developmental model. It's develops by functioning and functions by developing because it's self-organizing. That's what makes it aspirational. So that's why aspirational development and Jungian self are tied together. Yeah, okay, a little bit more. So John talks about how we can set up this interaction with these imaginal symbolic entities such as archetypes. I think again there's like hierarchies here where like not all of these things are archetypes, or they're like there are different maybe scales of archetypal forces. Like for example, you could consider the pantheon of Greek gods to be archetypal, but they might not be quite so archetypal as Mother, Father, and Divine Son, something like that, Divine Child. Um, you know, yeah. So there might be different, obviously, layers to this. And so the idea is that through interaction, imaginal symbolic interaction for Jung in the form of active imagination with these different archetypes, that they can be internalized into one's perspective so that one can interact with different archetypes that will be gradually internalized in the way that the ego self-organizes. And that is for Jung, that's what individuation is about. That's what self-development is about. And ultimately for Jung, this is what this dialogue between ego and self is about. The way that we become more like the self is by doing that process of withdrawing projection and internalizing the perspective of the different archetypes within. Yeah, so for Jung, John talks about the axis mundi, or the axis of the world is this correspond this alignment between ego and self in this way. Okay. Yeah, so dialoguing through the archetypes with the self. Or it's becoming more like the self through the dialogue with archetypes, through internalization of archetypes, through integration of archetypes, archetypal forces. I think again, this is we can really see how I think the soul or anima is influenced by unconscious forces. And I think we can see that the process of working with archetypal forces is equivalent to the, I would say, Hermetic and Gnostic, and maybe alchemical, I'm not sure, notion of liberating the soul. But the thing is that liberating the soul is not escaping, it's not the Gnostic ascent out. It's liberating the soul from unconscious influence so that the perspective of the soul is freed to participate more deeply, so that the perspective of the soul is not so strongly constrained, so that the soul can set limits for itself. Yep. And so, yes, it's the same process of transformation that one's participating in the world is altered by this individuation process. Yep, and that's through dialogue. That's for Jung, it's through dialogue with the anima, dialogue with the soul. One becomes more like the self. Yet, obviously, Jung has this deep critique of literalism and fundamentalism here because we need this imaginal way of participating. Look, I mean, look at this Christian symbolism. Jung talks about the way of the cross, the archetype of the cross is connected with mandalas and with quaternity and with the self. Christ is a symbol of the self. That's all implicit here. Yeah, so when we fall into literalism and fundamentalism, we lose the imaginal. We can see how this is clearly connected with McGilchrist at this point, with the left hemisphere runaway dynamic between the hand-derived manipulation of the world and um, with tool making and with abstraction. Again, that's from this Human Origins playlist. And in this way, we lose the being mode. This is why the process of the ecology of practices is so deep, right? Because it's really going right back into our history and saying, hey, it was really when we started to make stone tools that that we broke the agent arena coupling dynamic with the world. And then we got seduced by the left hemisphere. We got seduced by the emissary. And that what happened was that we started to objectify and manipulate objects, right, in the left hemispheric way, moving things around as if they were dead objects. And they're not. It's not true. It's a story. And that story is actually it's just that. It's a story that we've been inhabiting for a very, very, very long time. And that is the fall. That is the split condition from one becomes two. The idea being that to return is not to make the regressive pre-trans fallacy of going back into a state of unity, primordial unity, but is to go forward from two comes three, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. That this interaction between two, between S1 and S2, between subject and object, between abstract and sensory, between ego and self, can give rise to a different and deeper perspectival and participatory way of being in the world. Can we see how this ties everything together? It ties Jung, it ties Vervaeke, it ties Schmachtenberger. Well, I mean, those are the most important influences upon me. So, I mean, the whole point is, yeah, I mean, for me, the whole point is it's all very well to tie different thoughts and thinkers together, but to take things back to, self-organizing DAO structures through Jordan Hall and like that is like, yeah, but what about our being in the world? So like a metacrisis. So the idea is that we can reverse engineer ourselves not just into a different perspectival and participatory way of participating in the world, but that so that we can create differently, so that we can solve problems differently, so that we can respond to the situation that we find ourselves in. Because to me, that's what's relevant. Yeah. And so, yes, we can clearly see how literalism and fundamentalism, which I'm talking about as derived from the left hemisphere and its reduction to the story of objectification, loses the being mode, loses the imaginal, loses the symbolic, and is a form of hubris. And I think that's what Jung is talking about when he's talking about hypostatization, which is the sort of drawing down of an abstract concept into reality. That's what he means when sort of to define God as all good or as all knowing or as all wise is to hypostatize in a way that Jung feels is hubristic because God is not subject to our philosophical speculations, our definitions. So there's a way that definition or language may be limited in a certain way. Although we want to be careful not to hubristically hypostasize that which cannot be or should not be because the consequences of it are dire. Yeah, and so I think we can see the hubris of that here. It's a form of inflation in which the ego pretends that it's sufficient unto itself, and it pretends that it can take on the role of the self. Meaning, if there are qualities that are attributed to an atheistic God, well, who's saying that? Because maybe it's not the same to everyone. And we can see here how the process of aspirational development, proleptic rationality, is designed to get us out of our own head, you know, to get us to engage and get us to aspire, get us to become more. And not just not just more, but also become, it's not just about more. Yeah, and so this is why I don't get the going through Jung to return to fundamentalist Christianity thing. And like I'm trying to be as charitable as I can. Again, I've talked at length about how it's not about ragging on any one particular story, but where we get stuck in one particular story, I find that to be a, a step backwards rather than a step forwards. And yes, we do need to be able to inhabit and rely on particular stories that we can think of as constitutive elements of culture that involve belonging and community and coherence and communion. But this flexibility of our storytelling, the capacity to take different perspectives, to participate differently as needed, I think that's what we're asked to do. Yeah, that's right. So contradictory to step back. Okay, we're just going to finish off with this criticism of Jung to say, yeah, John's just wanting to say, um, what's he saying here? Yeah, Jung understands it all as happening interpsychically, and yes, he's referring to Anderson Todd, who's saying kind of what I was saying is that Jung, the later Jung is sort of breaking out of this purely psychological way of talking. So when we understand the unconscious, when we understand the archetypes, they're between psyche and cosmos, they're between self and world. Yes, Jung leaves behind his Kantianism towards the end, increasingly. Yeah, we need to understand the archetypes transjectively. Jung doesn't have the existential modes, the having and being mode, for example. So he doesn't have really a way of representing this transjective relationship. So yeah, and so there's a way that Jung's very introverted, it's sort of like active imagination is something that's quite within, in a sense. But there's a way that this imaginal way of being is supposed to involve us out in the world. I've been trying to point to that. Yeah, Corbin is Neoplatonic, not Kantian. Yeah, but Jung's saying, yeah, but we need a psychology. How does this internalization process work? How does the imaginal get internalized into the depths of the psyche? That's what Jung is really pointing to. Okay, and that is sort of toward the end of episode 49. And now, okay. So what else to talk about here? I think we can see how, yes, this process is mostly geared toward individual development. I think what I want to suggest at the end here is that we can see how this is deeply tied to processes of collective intelligence and distributed cognition, and that when we inhabit an imaginal world, we may be able to see people in their aspect of shining forth. So there's like an imaginal layer, which is in some sense above the egoic layer, that can be evoked in group process. I talked also about, this is over again in the psychological type series, about eight. It's sort of again, there's a transjective center of awareness and there's an intersubjective center of awareness, or there can be, I'm saying, that can be constellated. And those are different. And so that's why this understanding this dynamic language, the language of opponent processing and the language of aspiration is really required because I'm really talking about the whole point. The whole point is that any duality that we can define, so intrasubjective and intersubjective, co-transformation of both, self and world, co-transformation of both. What else? Um, individual and collective, co-transformation of both. S1 and S2, ego and divine double, co-transformation of both. Again, wait, sorry. Co-transformation of S1 and S2 via the divine double, because the divine double is not S2, it is a symbol. And the whole point is that the Jungian self is a center of awareness that is manifest in the form of symbols. So what I want to talk about is that when we can hold any of these different dualities and work with them, right? That we can that look, and what that really means is that any duality that we can define that we feel has validity, that we practice being able to take both perspectives, that we practice being able to see things in terms of the story of that duality, to inhabit that identity. That when we do that, when we participate in that story, let me give you an example. Like what that unlocks is inner spaciousness. What that another way to say that is that what that unlocks is that the soul is not so unconsciously influenced by that story, by those characters, and that the soul therefore gains facility with creation. the soul is liberated by that process. And it's not liberated into transcendence. It's not liberated into ungroundedness. It's liberated into capacity. It's liberated into incarnation. Okay. So I'm going to try and give an example of that in order to work with a duality like intrapsychic and yeah, intrasubjective and intersubjective. What I mean is that we can use objects in some way to constellate a intersubjective center of awareness that we would need to cultivate the capacity to indwell as a perspective, as a point of view, while also cultivating the capacity to take up an intrasubjective center of awareness. And that's so important because again, the 20th century was full of cults and commies. And the individual and collective dynamics are so messed up in our culture that it's so easy to fall to either side here, either toward narcissism, where we just get to create ourselves however we want to, and it's deeply avoiding so much. Like I'm kind of saying, for example, if you go along to any of these intentional communities, you can sort of see there's a lot of people wearing a lot of feathers and a lot of, the big dumb hat crowd. It's like, well, there's a lot of flexibility in people's identity, this is kind of like that. This is like that on steroids. And so it's not just that. It's not just this capacity to take on different identities. It's an aspirational process of like development towards more rationality and more wisdom with an ecology of practices in a community of practitioners, that all of this is required in order to avoid the narcissistic traps that involve, yeah, autodidacticism and ego inflation. And that if we're talking about centers of intersubjective awareness, well then, that can't be totalizing. That can't be centralizing. That can't be, because that can be really dangerous too. And so that's why qualities like liberty, fraternity, equality, autonomy, and yeah, I just think this can so easily be reified back into literalist or fundamentalist versions of, the AI singleton, let's create a god to help us transcend this human realm kind of vibe. This is not, and so this is why Jung centers everything on symbols. It's because when we have these symbols, they afford our access to that which is between and beneath all duality. And they help us not get sucked to either side. Because what we're going to see is that we've inherited so deeply, we've internalized so deeply this objectifying, literalizing, not just language, but way of being that causes us to sort of, yeah, it's difficult to talk about what that causes us to do, but it's very tempting to very quickly fall off one direction or the other. And being able to stay with, being able to hold the tension. I mean, so much work is really necessary. I think we can see, and this is why embodied practice, dialogical practice, relational practice, imaginal practice, and mindfulness practice, all this is really required for it to be wise and rational and not cultish. We could then talk about within and between groups in terms maybe of endogamy and exogamy. So obviously we're also wanting to gear toward coherence and bonding, belonging, togetherness, right? Communion, which is all wonderful, right? Awesome. Meaning and connection and inspiration, and healing in groups, relationality that can hopefully creatively solve real problems in the world. but that we don't also want to descend back into tribal violence and something like, just a brief example through Tyson Yungkaporta, I'm sort of taking this. The indigenous Australians had this model of a whole fractal tribal network across an entire continent, this very complex uh, relational web. And so it's not just within the psyche, and it's not just within the community. It's also not just intra-psychic, but also inter-psychic, right? And not just intra-tribal, but also inter-tribal. So the principles here are fractal relationality, because otherwise there's a risk here of descending into really strong unity, and it's like and cults, and then that's how you get war again. Yeah, I think again I would leave it on Rilke. Everything here seems to need us, and by their fruits you shall know them, as sort of normative guidelines. I'm really not interested in Gnostic ascent and escape and toward transcendence because it's fun. I mean, I'm sure it is, but to me, it's like it's not that meaningful, really. The lotus eating side of it. What happens afterwards? Are we down and among the people? In Buddhism, the 10th ox herding painting. Like, I mean, go look that up, but it's like, yeah, the fourth of the 10 paintings is the Buddha spaced out in the clouds. The 10th one is down in the market with helping hands. It's this kind of thing. Like Jordan Hall's Does It Grow Corn? Does it grow corn? I think this is why understanding the ties here to the grounding in not only the ecology of practices but the community of practices, the monastery model running a wisdom school. That's why this is so important because it's grounded back down in situational awareness and the context of place, our place in time. And yes, Kairos, yes, the eternal return, yes, to not just me now and me then, but me incarnated and me in a, I don't know, you can say different layer or higher plane, however you want to talk about it, without reifying a dualism. But yeah, to me, it is ultimately about bringing that to be here and among and down and the people, right? I mean, the human people. This is what my care is toward Yeah, I mean, I might mention Heidegger's care for being, that we have a responsibility it's not just to become, but it's to be here on Earth, and to care for we are the to care for the being and care for our being in the world. It's like shepherding being, and I think that's finding our place in the world, meaning planet Earth.